Oh, what an introduction. Thank you everyone for joining us here this evening in this beautiful historic bookshop. It's lovely to see such a gorgeous crowd. I've spotted, I won't look at anyone in particular, a couple of troublemakers actually already. So I shall try my best to be in control, but we'll see how we go. First things first, I ought to check with you because I checked when we met a couple of weeks ago, James Cahill, and then you were just called James Cahill.
So, I say Cahill. Cahill is how an Irish person would say it,
Right.
Which is how it's meant to be said, but
never Cahill.
It's not meant to be, but a lot of people will say that.
Do you correct people when they do it?
It depends.
Is that the bane of your life?
It depends, sometimes, but...
You have bigger banes. Thank you for joining us this evening. I think it goes without saying, really, that James is already, after only 2 novels, one of which has just been released, an admired author and a celebrated author. Your reviews are extraordinary, and I'm envious of them. And it's no wonder, because your writing is lyrical and filled with light and colour, and no surprise, given your background. For those who don't know much about your background, could we begin just by giving them a précis, perhaps, of where you come from as a novelist?
Yes, absolutely. I'll try and be brief, but in a way, as you know, my whole life is in this novel, so I could begin at the very beginning. I mean, I was born in London, grew up when we were very small in South London, and in fact, that South London setting comes into my first novel, Tiepolo Blue. That was quite heavily based on early childhood memories of South London, and really was in London growing up, at school until I went to university, studied English and classics originally, so was always interested in antiquity and the ancient world, but also the way in which the classics, ancient Greece and Rome, have been kind of assimilated into later eras and cultures and literature. That was always something I was very interested in, and that, I think, comes into my writing and thinking a lot.
You worked in the art world, didn't you?
I did. So after I studied contemporary art after that. I've really been all over the place, academically and in other ways. And then I found myself in my first job working at a contemporary gallery called Sadie Cole's HQ, which is about 5 minutes down the road from here. And then and now is one of London's leading contemporary galleries. It was a really fun, exciting, inspiring place to work in many ways, because it had represented many of those artists who were at the centre of the 1990s young British artist phenomenon, although it was a few years on from that when I joined, and I got to meet a number of those people and became very interested in that whole...
Because they were known by a term, weren't they? What was the term they were known by?
Well, Brit art was one of the things, or YBAs, or
YBAs,
these different...
that's the one
They always hated these terms, actually, that always, I suppose, like a lot of writers and artists, as soon as you try and label them, they were very resistant to it. But I was at the gallery on and off. I say on and off because I studied and did other things, and they were very generous to me, gave me a lot of leeway. But I was there for about 12 years in total, and that experience filters very directly into this novel, more so than the first one, in a way, because this is set in the present, or the near present, and it's very much about that contemporary art world.
Did you sense over those 12 years, when you were meeting different characters and, I don't know, maybe judging them as we do, that in a way they were writing this novel, and to a lesser extent the previous novel? Did you sense that you would be a writer and that they would be on a page one day, or has that come as a bit of a surprise to you?
It possibly wasn't as conscious as that. It's funny, I mean, I've heard it said, it's a cliche almost, that writing is your revenge on life, and I don't know whether, as I met certain people, particularly certain difficult collectors, of which there were many, whether I was thinking semi-consciously or subconsciously, I'm going to make you into something, I'm going to do something with this experience. I don't know. I did want to write, and I was writing. That was a big part of my job, although it was non-fiction. And I was reviewing and writing about art in that way. The idea of writing a novel was really at the back of my mind. It was an ambition, you know, it had been there since I was about 13 or 14, but no, it wasn't a very deliberate thought while I was working there, which was probably for the best. And then, I mean, Tiepolo Blue began to happen towards the end of my time there. but it was pretty organic. It was just,
So it was kind of scraps of memories. You weren't going back to a notepad thinking, there was that awful person who came into the gallery and I have to write them into page 52. It was more organic than that.
It had to be, because there were experiences just like that. You know, there's, for example, an awful, rich collector he was an arms dealer. We never worked with him again when we found this out.
It's a good start. How did you know he was an arms dealer? Did he walk in with a massive gun?
It didn't take two. It wasn't that hard to find out. No, he seemed okay on the surface, but I remember he came in and grabbed a sculpture that he considered he'd bought off of its pedestal in the middle of an exhibition, walked out with it, chucked it in his car. And I was so appalled by it, I ran out and grabbed it out of the back seat and took it back and then hid it in the cupboard. But the sort of bravest thing I ever did. But that sort of event, I knew I couldn't turn it directly into, or even indirectly into something in fiction. I wanted, and the characters...
Because that's a good example. As I say this as a novelist myself. So if you'd have written something like that into a novel, then you'd have spent the rest of your life defending it as having happened, because people think that just couldn't possibly.
There are things like that are stranger than fiction, and it's funny, occasionally, actually, I don't know if you've had a similar experience, where I have based something originally on something that's happened. It's been quite hard to reenact it, to make it quite as funny or as weird as it seemed at the time. So actually, inventing is easier, it's more freeing. And I always say this, like a disclaimer, the characters in particular are not based on people, real life people. The main character in this, or one of the main characters, is an art dealer in her 40s, British woman in New York. I was worried that my former boss was going to think this was somehow her, and it really wasn't. It didn't occur to me in the time I was writing it that she might think that, or it was outside of my thinking until quite late on, when I thought, well, naturally she's going to think this. And fortunately, she saw that it wasn't her. And none of those characters is based on a real person, because that, again, would feel too limiting, like I've got to tie it to this real-life model.
And we will... there weren't many hands raised when we asked how many people had read The Violet Hour yet. Am I right? Yes. But a lot of people here might have read Tiepolo Blue. I'm going to make that assumption. Right, all right. We will be talking in more detail about the novel. But I was interested to ask you, actually, and you hinted at it already, at what point you think you became a writer, whether there was a time... from my experience, when I was reading as a child, I was woefully unpopular at school and regularly punched. And so I found my friendships in books, and I knew maybe at the age of 7 or 8 that I wanted to be a novelist. Was it that early for you, or was it something that kind of came through more slowly?
Yeah, I love that idea, by the way, of finding friendship in books, because I reckon I was similar. Certainly by the age of 12, 13, 14, I was reading a lot. And there were lots of formative moments, sort of tremors rather than this one sort of earthquake where I thought, yes, this is something that I love. But there was something that does stand out was, I guess I was about 14 when I read To the Lighthouse by Virginia Woolf, and I did find every sentence, every paragraph in that mesmerising. I know not everyone does, but it had that effect on me then. I don't know whether it would if I read it again. I haven't read it since. But it was something to do with the intensity with which she conveyed consciousness and feeling, and what it is to exist in the world, but also in your mind, and the way you experience one through the other, inevitably. And then more particularly, it has that very famous scene at the end that I love, where the painter character, who's called Lily Briscoe, is struggling to sort of complete her painting, and sort of agonising over the placement of a wall and a tree, and finally has this breakthrough where she just knows it's right. And I loved that, because it was something to do with the difficulty of, I suppose, communicating stuff in words or in pictures, but then just occasionally feeling like for a moment perhaps you've done it, and that sort of moment of epiphany, that was something that stood out. And I think also there and in other places in that book, the way in which very small, tiny things become invested with a huge amount of sort of feeling and meaning. The idea that something seemingly really trivial, like a chain of bubbles or something, could become immensely sort of significant. I love that.
There's some beautiful language in the book, and in a second I'd like to ask you to just read a little from the opening, if that's okay. But you had the effect on me as a writer that few writers have, and I hate them for it. So that feeling of when you find prose so beautiful and yet so tragic and terrifying, because you think, I wouldn't have written that. and I would have liked to. And I mean that as a great compliment to you. Would you like to just read us from the opening? I can give you
I would
this
love
copy
to. Yes, please.
I don't know how you feel about this, by the way. I know that that's kind of a law-breaking thing for some people, but I've scribbled throughout this book and turned over corners.
This is the thrill to see annotations already on the copy.
Well, I can't read any of them, but I'm sure that they're profound. Anyway, there we are.
Thank you. I'm going to read the very first page, so it's a short reading, but for people that haven't read it, I hope it's a little bit of a sort of taster or enticing scene setter. And actually, it's worth saying perhaps also, this novel ranges all over the place. London, New York, Venice, Switzerland, but it starts close to home in London on a summer evening, a bright evening, not so different from this one. The 5th of September at 7:39 in London. The evening was so still that it could have been a picture. If anyone had been watching from the neighbouring tower block, the scene might have resembled a panoramic painting, a modern-day Bruegel, only without the people, or the final shot of a film, the deserted road below, the treetops and roofs, the dome of the Imperial War Museum, the sky turning lilac. Evening sunlight was catching the edges of things. A terrace of 1970s houses receded along one side of the road, meeting the vertical form of a Victorian water tower. Close to the top was a steel balcony, its outer corner a triangle of light. A young man appeared on the balcony, disturbing the illusion. His lips motioned a phrase, as though he were addressing someone through the door. Stepping back, he glanced at the sky. Then he spread his hands on the railings and drew his body upwards, sitting on the ledge. Sunlight struck his face and the blank of his t-shirt. Everything was still again, without even a breeze to animate the plane trees on the road. Then, abruptly, he toppled back, his body separating from the building. His trainers scissored above him. The sunlight had retreated from the patch of ground where he landed. His body lay motionless. Face down, with his arms outspread, he seemed to be floating on grey water. Only the fingertips of one hand reached into the light.
Yes, indeed. There's such a kind of clear colour to it. It flows so beautifully. I'm trying desperately to avoid a river metaphor here, but it does. And I wonder how closely you pick at your language, whether you are writing in a very kind of fluid state and then you go back, or whether you are troubling over every word, because your choice of words, your vocabulary in the book is so spot on always.
Well, I'm really glad you say that, obviously, but the truth is that it's a little bit of both. When I write, I often write longhand first, and it feels, in the best instances, like it flows pretty fluidly, but
you write in pen and ink?
I write in pencil, actually, usually. I just quite like the feel of, pencil on paper.
That's quite an unusual thing these days, isn't it? To write, rather than writing digitally, to actually write.
Yeah, it's not exclusively that. I will sometimes use a computer too, and type stuff, but often, actually, I find that easier to write. It just somehow kind of comes out easier doing that. It's something to do, I guess, with the blank of a computer screen and, that feeling like a little bit of a wall or an obstacle. But yeah, writing by hand, I do a lot. And certainly the first novel, it was almost entirely that. But then I do go back and I do fuss over words. I do a lot of, and particularly that first scene, actually, I'll be honest, I spent a lot of time refining it in very small ways. I wanted that scene, more than many of them, to feel like a picture. It's a set piece. The reference to Bruegel is obviously very calculated because it's meant to be like a Fall of Icarus moment. So the whole thing is supposed to feel like a film still.
At the same time, of course, because this is largely based in the contemporary art world, I was really struck by the triangle of light and the colour that you gave that, and the colours of the sky, And to me, actually, the impression I was left with at the end of that very striking scene was less like a Bruegel, and more actually like a contemporary print, like a square canvas with the triangle of light on it and this figure shooting down with his legs scissoring.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you say that, because I don't want to pin it to Bruegel either, and actually rarely do I want a model just to sort of shine through as the singular thing, so that someone would be like, oh right, this is Bruegel. It's nice actually if Triangle of Light might also sort of make you think of, I don't know, Dan Flavin or something, or minimalist sculpture, or the Falling Man could be another point of reference here, the photo from the Twin Towers. There's all sorts of things going on. And the best thing is if all of those sorts of resonances are kind of happening simultaneously, actually, instead of it being just the one thing.
And the built environment, I absolutely am adamant that in any of my interviews I won't say, but I'm going to say it now anyway, because it's almost like the locations are a character in themselves. Yeah. I'm not going to say that, but I'm also sort of going to say that. But in your writing of the locations, the urban environment, actually, I can tell that you really enjoyed writing that as much as you did the characters. You used a wonderful word which I've already forgotten. Is it loggia? Or no, I've made that.
Oh, possibly, yeah.
It's like an arch. I had to do some googling while I was reading. Forgive me.
Well, I have to Google these things too. I mean, it doesn't just kind of flow out.
How does he know what that's called? It's the bit on the side of a restaurant with arched windows. I thought, who knows that word?
Yeah, and I think I have to check all of that stuff too. Of course, you give the impression, like people do in sort of refined conversation, that they know all this stuff, but rarely do I. And I know that you, for example, do a lot of research. Your books are very closely researched. I'm reading AJ's book at the moment, and it is marvelous. And I can tell that it's worn lightly, but there's a lot of research in there. These things are not things
I love researching environments, and actually, I think that's one of the reasons I really enjoyed your writing. Was even though, of course, it's contemporary rather than historical, the attention to detail of the architecture and the style and the size, the breadth of the street, it all felt so authentic.
Well, I'm glad, and the thing about architecture is significant, because more perhaps even than Tiepolo Blue, this is a book about cities partly. I mentioned before some of the different locations. You have these three main characters, each in a different place at the beginning of the story. There's Lorna, the dealer, the art dealer in her 40s, who's in New York. She runs a Manhattan gallery. She's this quite cool, sort of, renowned Manhattan art world figure. There's Thomas, this globally successful abstract painter who has seemingly retreated from the art world to live in the town of Montreux on the edge of Lake Geneva. And I've actually never been there, so I had to entirely base that on Google Images and Google Street View and all of that kind of thing. I had a sense of what a sort of, an upmarket Swiss town
I
that
just
the
thought
lake
that
would
was
be
your
like.
fifth property or something.
I wish. I mean, and I would love a house like he has, this incredible house up the mountain from the town with a view over the lake.
Well, I geeked out for this because I thought this is my ideal house. Not only is it bathed in constant sunlight, but it was also a former...
It was like a cable car station.
A former cable car station, which, I mean, I've been obsessed with cable cars for many years. So we're not going to talk about that in any great detail, but I could for a full hour. But it felt very real to me.
Well, that was another piece of research, actually. I had to go into the sort of mechanics of how a cable car works in order to make it real, that there's this shell of a station that he then grew his house out of.
So
and
what
built
extent
onto it.
is that a metaphor? Are people in coming years going to decide that you're making some great statement about people wanting to be elevated but no longer can because the ghost of the cable car has gone? Or was it literally just, I thought that, or did you just think, oh, that looks like a fun way to set the base for this artist?
I think it came to me while I was writing the thing. I can't quite remember now. I mean, there's a biographical component to it because his parents used to man the cable car, and then it got discontinued and they became isolated as a family, and that's part of why he's so screwed up in a way. He's very isolated. He's got this sense of his own separateness from other people and the world. And as I say, he's retreated to this house that he's built around that station, this incredible ultra-minimalist, ultra-modernist house on the mountainside. But I should add that the other city that's important in this novel is New York, which is inhabited by a man called Leo Goffman, who is a real estate tycoon in his 80s, this man of immense wealth and immense self-regard. And for him, perhaps more than anyone, the city is this extension of him. He's, because he's lived real estate, there are aspects of him not entirely unlike Trump. He looks out of this kind of plate glass window of his Manhattan apartment, and he looks at the buildings that he's owned or built or had some sort of association with. And as with the artwork that's in the room at a closer remove, it's all an externalization of him in little embodiments or larger embodiments of who he is and what he thinks of himself. So the city, this thing about the city being a character, I know it's such a cliche, but it's a helpful one there, because it kind of is. It's his character beyond him, all around him.
Well, he's collecting artworks like cupcakes, isn't he? Like multi-million-pound artworks. He just goes and says, "I'll have all of them."
Yeah.
Was that something that you did witness? People saying, "I'll have that wall there."
You know what? In reality, they're not quite as crass as that usually. I made him. I mean, sometimes I suppose with fiction, and it's possibly more the case with TV, you slightly up the ante in terms of how someone would behave. And I'm sure there are collectors who are a bit like that. I never witnessed anything quite that bad, because we're talking about a moment where he sort of strolls into a gallery. There's a suite of pictures on the wall, and he just says, "Yeah, fine, I'll have the lot." In reality, a dealer would probably say, "Well, you can't have all of them because I've got other people who want to buy them, and you're not going to get all 5." But he does in this book.
He doesn't. I mean, you talk about him in the more negative sense, but there is more to him than that. There's a certain sweetness and tragedy actually to this man, that he is. His physical decrepitude, there's also a loss there, a sense of longing as well, which, without spoiling anything, is very much a part of his character by the time you finish the book. And I found that quite moving. Of all the characters, actually, I found myself moved by him the most, which surprised me.
Well, that's good, because I wanted him to be a tragic figure, not just a repellent or ridiculous figure, and he is sort of both of those too. But as is so often the case, behind what you see on the surface in terms of someone's demeanour or character, there's a hell of a lot going on in terms of his experience and memory and pain. And those were things I wanted to communicate. And for him, actually, collecting art has been this kind of long-term form of consolation, consoling himself for things he's lost, things he hasn't had, having to face the pain of being who he is, the kind of person he is, the difficulty of being him. So I wanted that complexity to be there, and I think some readers probably will end up, in spite of themselves, liking him. There's a character within the story, Lorna, who sort of has that experience, goes perhaps from finding him impossible to seeing him in a different light, and maybe that's what fiction is about more generally, sort of correcting or changing or deepening your view of something.
Do you know what character I couldn't stand?
Go on.
Can you guess? I wonder if it was deliberate. It was so subtly done, but I couldn't stand them. It summed up everything I dislike about people in today's age.
How about Thomas the painter?
No.
Justine.
Yes. It was. Not everyone will dislike Justine, I don't think. But I just found that insufferable. So sanctimonious and self-important and selfish, and so quick to proselytise. And I just thought, you are everything I hate about social media and the modern world. And to pull this back to some sort of question rather than just a personal rant, just at the last moment, there's actually a similarity here, isn't there, thematically with Tiepolo Blue, that we have an elderly white privileged man who is cancelled, effectively, in Tiepolo Blue, sort of, although the term didn't exist there.
Yeah.
And then in this novel as well, you mentioned Leo, and again, I'm not spoiling anything here, but he rides pretty close to the wind of being cancelled. And I thought what was really fascinating about that was you're charting, in a way, the maturing and the evolution of cancel culture, because he probably would have been a few years ago, and then he isn't now. Anyway, that's quite a broad question.
Yeah.
Was that intentional anyway, to make that comment on society?
I mean, it's a really interesting question, and it's something, obviously, which is in my mind because it's in the kind of popular consciousness, and it's something we've all been thinking about or hearing about or experiencing. So to that extent, I suppose I'm just trying to reflect something that's happening. And that was, I guess, the case in Tiepolo Blue, even though it's set in the mid-1990s, those sorts of things were beginning to be thought about or considered. And in fact, there's a moment in that book where somebody plucks this term political correctness and in a disapproving way, and someone else says, oh yeah, that term is doing the rounds. And it was kind of the time that term it entered popular currency. So, and that was the sort of origins of, maybe a larger, more pervasive cultural situation.
Because Leo deserves cancellation more.
Yeah, I mean,
arguably,
as you say, he sails pretty close to the wind. Yeah. He says and does things that are just not.
Yeah, gets away with it. And I thought, is this a comment actually on, how impotent that urge to try and destroy very wealthy people has become in today's age, or am I thinking too much?
It's an interesting thought. I don't think I intended a comment really of any. In fact, rarely do I, or hopefully never do I, sort of think this is a message I want to impart, a political or ethical message, because I guess I would feel that began to interfere with the realism of the thing if I was trying to communicate an idea or an ideal of my own. But it's certainly true that it's something that's there. I can't deny that. And Leo is an example of somebody who just says what the hell he wants whenever. And, that raises the question, well, what are the consequences of that? What does it mean to speak, to think, or to speak completely freely without shame or compunction or anything? And what does it look like? And what does it look like if you have immense power and wealth versus someone who doesn't? These are interesting questions, or really urgent ones. But I hope I wasn't steering a reader too much towards a sort of an answer necessarily.
No, I mean, one of the joys, I think, with great fiction is that each reader brings their own experiences to that book and comes to their own conclusions about the characters. And so my version of Leo would be very different to other people's versions of Leo, and they would have very different emotional responses, to Justine as well. There will be people who read Justine and think, yeah, I really like you, I'm on your side.
Most people seem to dislike her, actually. Most people.
Well, it's because Lorna's very likeable. You're with Lorna.
Yes, that's right. And just to explain, actually, Justine is the long-term girlfriend of Lorna, the art dealer character, and at the beginning of the novel their relationship's kind of crumbling, partly because of what you've said about Justine as a person. She's not an easy person to live with, and the relationship's kind of reached this impasse, and that's part of Lorna's kind of difficulty at the beginning, how to move on from that, whether she wants to, whether she's going to be able to outgrow or outlive this relationship that she's had for 10 years.
You've been complimented by gay women. I don't know if you're aware of this. Generally, I'm sure, but over the years. But with this book, particularly, and actually how you wrote a gay female lead character and how real she feels to lesbian readers, was that something that you did just because you have an affinity for women, do you think? Or is it because you had to try hard to do that and you put work into doing that? Or you had sensitivity readers, even? I'm looking at your editor here.
No, I mean, I just had a sense from the very beginning, and this was the same with Tiepolo Blue, actually, of this story of who the characters were. And this was before the whole story was there, before the settings were really in place. I had this sense of a woman, no longer young exactly. I mean, I'm 40 next month myself, so it's sort of just a little older than me. Successful, but someone who's resisted this kind of globalized, very high-end gallery model, someone with integrity. I had quite a clear sense of what this woman was going to be about. And actually, by the way, a lot of leading dealers in the contemporary art world are women. This is an interesting thing. Although we always think of sort of Larry Gagosian and some of these sort of really brash men at the top of their game, a lot of the really respected long-term dealers in London and New York are people like Sadie Coles, Marion Goodman, Barbara Gladstone in New York, Paula Cooper. And so I wanted to create that kind of character. And that's how that came about. It was as simple as that.
Her emotional instincts and her physical sexual responses actually to other women. For me, not being a lesbian woman, but still felt very real.
Well, I'm glad you say that, because you are aware, obviously, that you're writing someone's experience, the point of view of someone of a different sex, a different experience, different kind of desire. So there is that awareness. But I suppose it begins with just trying to sort of, as authentically as you can, inhabit this character, for there to be an emotional, psychological sort of authenticity or accuracy to it. and to kind of work out the details from there. I mean, one curious thing, and I'll admit to this, is I have a lesbian friend who I got to read some of the sex scenes, I think there's one sex scene with Lorna and Justine, just to say, just to find out what she thought. Have I got it right? And she liked it. I mean, she had ideas, but actually they weren't ideas that really, they were interesting, but I think it was almost towards making it too lush and graphic and kind of steamy, and I wanted to
it's quite
avoid
gentle
that.
washes of colour, if I can put it that way, isn't it? It allows you to fill in the gaps, for
Right.
want of a better phrase.
Right.
Penises, I have written on my phone. We'll move from lesbian love scenes to penises. I did want to ask you about this, not just because they're a particular enthusiasm of mine, but because actually they do make quite stark and quite pointed appearances at, certain points throughout the book. And I really felt as though it was almost like, when I was reading, it was like someone was drawing a kind of pen and ink drawing of each different penis. Now, I'm asking you about this for an intelligent reason, a literary reason. I want to make that very clear. But were you using the male appendage to symbolise the characters and the point of the plot, or am I just obsessed?
I mean, I remember this from working in the art world, and I knew Sarah Lucas really well, and her work is full of penises. I don't know, maybe the fascination came from that. But I
have here, the muscles were half concealed beneath a carapace of rippled skin. His erection was the single remnant of youth, solid as a tower, purplished and polished at the top. Lovely alliteration, with a glaring black eyelet. And there is another and there's another point. Well, it's good, isn't it? How can I not read that out? I've thought about that since at a few moments in the last couple of weeks. Good. But there is another scene where they're talking, having a conversation in front of a large photograph of a gentleman's penis that Lorna, the character Lorna, refuses to take down. So it is significant to the characters. I put it to you, it is significant to the plot, and you are using them actually to reflect something about them. Because just to finish the thought, Thomas, the young, very handsome guy, is often quite shriveled down there when it is mentioned, and that felt to me significant.
He has a certain block, a certain difficulty. Yeah, that's right. I mean, there are all sorts of places I could go with this. It actually feels like the largest topic we've yet addressed. The reading just there. I mean, I was interested in what it means to aestheticize things that are not always thought of as necessarily very beautiful, that we don't always want to sort of think about, and that often get elided in fiction, including contemporary fiction. I think there is still sometimes, for various reasons, a squeamishness. So just to decide to put it out there and, afford it the same level of description as anything else was important to me, because in the experience of these characters, it is something from time to time that they just see or come across or mean something that has a kind of aesthetic or erotic impact. So it has to be there. I don't want to kind of draw curtains or stick fig leaves in this novel, and I think it's important to go there. Something that's just popped into my mind is I recently read the new Edmund White memoir, The Loves of My Lives, it's called, which is sort of devoted to his sexual experiences, all his lovers and conquests and romances over the years, and it is eye-wateringly explicit. I mean, it makes this look demure. He includes every possible level of detail.
He's been accused of showing off.
Well, it is showing off in a way, and I think he realizes that it's defying you to be offended or sort of decide it's too much. But the sex scenes in this are, episodes within a much bigger tapestry, a much larger narrative. But where they occur, I want that detail. I want the spotlight to kind of shine on things in the way that it sometimes does, sometimes doesn't. When the experience occurs, when it's real. This idea of the question you had about whether it's always slightly symbolic. I mean, I guess, with like the male member, always a little bit is. There's always the symbolism and the literal thing. And that's something that's interesting in relation to the larger narrative anyway, literal objects versus something more abstract and metaphorical. That applies in a way that I won't go into in too much detail to Thomas's work, the painter.
Well, I think if I can put it to you, similarly, I suppose, to a painter, I find when I read back the first draft of my novels that I'm often putting symbolism, metaphor, simile into my writing that I wasn't necessarily aware of at the time, but that doesn't mean that that isn't what it is. That I think our brains are capable of writing into our words meaning that is part of us and our experience without us having to consciously do it.
Oh, entirely. And I mean, just to go back to Virginia Woolf, that episode I mentioned at the end where Lily Briscoe paints a line and that's the end of her painting and she's done it. There's a episode in this novel where, in fact, I think it's at the very beginning of part 2, Thomas, the painter, is in his studio alone, making a painting, and he draws a line with absolute sort of perfect fluke precision. It's freehand, but it's completely perfectly ruled, and he knows that that's just what he wanted. Now, I hadn't thought about that Virginia Woolf book for that episode for a long time, and I certainly wasn't thinking about it actively when I wrote this, but actually, I feel the inspiration was certainly there, and all of the metaphoric potential is there too. Yes, he's drawing a line, and that's that. But actually, again, in ways that relates to the wider story, it's a momentous, meaningful thing. It refers to something in his past.
You feel it does when you're reading James's work. One of the most wonderful things about it is you feel very much as though you are following someone who doesn't know whether it's not that there's a predictability to where you're going. It's that it doesn't matter whether you know where you're going or not. You just know where you are and you're confident, if I can put it that way.
Right.
I read a lot of books for endorsements and various things and for pleasure, and there are sometimes when I sense that the author doesn't quite know where they might be going, or if they do know where they're going, they're probably not sure they should be there. And it was a delight actually to live inside this book while I was reading it and just be able to relax, actually. A little bit like a child when you're being driven by a parent, you can fall asleep and not worry about what's going to happen. And I felt that way with this, that the confidence that you show and the control over the story that you were telling was remarkable. And I say that as someone who writes, I suppose it'd be called, try not to gag anyone, commercial historical fiction. Although I do like to think it's literary. But it does have a strong plot. Each chapter will end on a bang or a cliffhanger, and that's how I write.
And I'm finding this reading your book at the moment, and this is something that matters to me. And I want, however literary or the book is or not, I want there to be this sense of propulsion, and that often has to do with what am I going to find out? What was that thing at the beginning all about? I mean, that episode I read to you, what does that mean? How does that relate to the lives of these other people we're now meeting? It seems completely disconnected.
Your storytelling is so beguiling and so, sometimes elusive that you don't necessarily need to know exactly why that happened or why this is happening, because you're just happy and enjoying being there.
That's also true. And I perhaps, in earlier drafts, I think I have had an instinct sometimes to try and sort of resolve things more than you maybe need to. Like, okay, this is, to provide, it's that thing of drawing up the loose ends. Maybe you don't need to, maybe some of them, there's an implicit conclusion.
There's a great question in this book around childhood and parenthood, if I can put it as ambiguously as that. But the question is the more interesting thing, if I can say that. I'm trying to speak quite carefully here, not to ruin anything. But the questions being asked in the book are, I think, the core of the book. And I think it's the same with all of your writing. A couple of last questions before we go to audience questions. So please start thinking now of wonderful things you can ask. I'm sure it won't be difficult. People do have a way, don't they, when you've written 2 books, because I'm 2 books into my career as a published novelist, they think they can draw a line between the first book and the second book and then shoot that line off and then predict the rest of your career. It's enough. So do you think with Tiepolo Blue and The Violet Hour that people now are going to be expecting you very much to kind of stay on that line And are you going to?
Well, certainly, I don't think there will be another colour in the title of any book I write, because people have said many times, "Oh, is this now a spectrum? Is this now a suite?" No, and actually, it wasn't even very conscious or thought out when I decided that there would be a colour in the title of each of the novels. I just wanted to call it The Violet's Hour, partly because that's a phrase from The Wasteland that is in all sorts of ways an important reference in the story. And I hope that what comes next feels different, actually, and branches into new territory. And I think there's always that challenge. And I don't know if you find this a challenge. You want to sort of set yourself to try something a bit different, something new. I think that there's always going to appear to be some continuity from the point of view of a reader, because there are things about your sensibility and your style and your personality that will just be in there, and you shouldn't try and remove those or get around them or sort of impersonate a different kind of writer.
Isn't there in the industry as well to maintain some continuity in your writing? But then I don't know whether you've read any Michel Faber. Fabulous writer who bucks that entirely, and I'm sure deliberately and aggressively. I mean, he'll write, futuristic sci-fi one second, and then he writes The Crimson Petal and the White, the most extraordinary work of historical fiction. And he's clearly saying, no, you are not going to carry on writing the same sorts of books. And then you look at wonderful writers like, Ian McEwan or Isabel Allende or Sarah Waters. You think, well, actually, no, there is a linear element to these books, the direction they're taking.
I like the idea of being drastically different each time. And like I say, I would want to set a certain kind of challenge to myself to try a different narrative voice, a different sort of individual, maybe write in the first person rather than the third person, play with structure in a different way. I mean, an artist who did that in terms of, just changing completely every time was Martin Kippenberger, but then this became this kind of conceit in his work where it could be a different artist every time he made a body of work. It was sort of deliberately entirely unlike what he'd done before, and that was a very sort of postmodern self-conscious thing. I don't know if I would feel a need to do that. I think I would be pushing myself as far as possible for my own reasons to come up with something original.
We're all grasping here for a sense of what's coming next. What do we think? Have we got a sense? What do we think?
I'm not giving much away. I'm aware of that. There is something in my mind, but
So the pencil hasn't started scribbling yet.
I was saying to Isabel just earlier, it's begun to make a few little scribblings, but I quite enjoy the phase during which it just lives up here. I don't know if you have the same thing. Yeah. It feels like it's just protected. It belongs there, just to me. Yeah. Frankly, it doesn't start.
You start writing and thinking, that was really good in my head.
Exactly.
May I thank you for your books, but also for being such delightful company this evening and very kind behind the scenes. I've done quite a few interviews with my fellow authors now over the last couple of years, and you've been so wonderfully relaxed and happy to answer any questions. So I really appreciate that.
Thank you.
Shall we now go to some questions from the audience? I will do some rude pointing. For anyone who raises their hand. Anyone have anything they would like to ask? Hello.
We'll ask questions. So, obviously, I know you write magazine articles, you write about artists, and then you write novels. How do you have to put yourself into a different mindset when you're kind of sitting down to approach each of those, or a different environment?
That's a very interesting question. I don't know is my instinctive answer. They don't feel wholly different. I mean, with magazines and reviews and things, there's often the impetus of a deadline. I've got to get it done by a certain amount of time. I can't be an absolute perfectionist. This just has to be kind of put out there, and it'll be as good as it can be in the time I have. Although, having said that, I am actually very perfectionist, and I do always take too long over stuff. Whereas with novel writing, I suppose although there's a sense of wanting to get it done by an ultimate point, there isn't that pressure in the same way, and that probably means that the writing takes a different form and follows a different structure. I suppose also with my more journalistic writing, it's not more mechanical, but in some ways it's just more of a day-to-day thing. I find the very earliest stages of fiction writing mentally quite exhausting. I wouldn't be able to do it all day. I physically wouldn't be able to. I maybe could do a few good hours of that, and then I have to do something else, a different kind of writing. So actually the journalism, reviews, that sort of stuff is quite a nice antidote or place to escape to versus this kind of writing.
Do you see yourself as I'm a novelist who also does other things, or do you see yourself as someone who does all of these different things and you're a novelist?
I think that changes a bit one day to the next, actually. I don't. It's probably part of an identity
Today I'm a man making a
crisis.
sandwich and also a novelist. And then tomorrow I'm going to the pub, but I'm also a novelist.
Exactly. I think that, no, I mean, I'm the novel writing has a lot of importance for me, and it's something I'm very committed to. But then I love writing about, I did the reviewing and writing about art from an earlier age and an earlier point. So that's also, a big part of my identity. Yeah.
Any other questions? Yes, we have this gentleman in the baseball cap.
James, lovely talk, and as you know, I love the novel very much. I've got a question that's kind of about, I guess, the historicity of it and the kind of the sense of now or just recently. The art world that you describe is so fascinating for people who aren't in it, partly because there is this peculiar intersection between massive wealth and the aesthetic, and this kind of strange kind of world where somehow value is conferred on things that to an average eye don't seem to have like instrumental use and might not even be conventionally attractive or whatever. And this really fascinating world of a sort of cultural capital being exchanged into the kinds of assets that you bank and you put in it's an unusual way that art has been treated that we're in now. It's not like the whole history of art. It's a specific moment, right? Do you think this is gonna last? I mean, as in the world that you're describing, is it kind of safe? Is it one which is kind of going to survive the world of Bitcoin, the decimation of the humanities education, where lots of that value is conferred?
So you've charted how the art world has changed from the 90s to today. Do you think it's going to continue to ossify and become more commercialised?
Futurist novel. What would you see art doing?
I mean, this just to take one point of the question and then maybe branch out from that. This idea of how we ascribe value, particularly in contemporary art, but in art more generally, is something which has always been intriguing to me and fascinating to me. And I guess from Duchamp onward, or possibly from before, the whole thing that artists play with is, why is this valuable? Could you use a Rembrandt as an ironing board, or does the ironing board possibly become as valuable as a Rembrandt if you stick that on the wall? And that's the whole game that artists are often playing, in the knowledge that it's a very sort of tricky one or tricksy one. And the irony or the weird paradox also is that a lot of contemporary art has enormous value. It's been agreed by this kind of critical commercial consensus that these works, these artists matter, these are important. I think Grayson Perry called it the happy consensus. People sometimes also think of it as a very cozy consensus. We know that Warhol is just valuable mostly, and probably always will be. So in some ways it's as safe as houses as well. Despite all of that game playing at the conceptual end, there's a way in which certain things are sort of reified and made valuable, imbued with value, which is why it's this kind of asset class and something that people with a lot of money do invest in. Although my experience often or always was that these incredibly wealthy collectors invariably do have a deep love of and curiosity about art, what it means, why it's made, what artists do. To artists, to these sorts of people, are this completely exotic species. This idea that there are some people who are just buying it for its putative value because they want to flip it or they regard it as another form of sort of investment. I never really encountered many people like that, actually. This question of what art means to rich people is a much more complicated one than some people might like to suppose. I don't know what the art world will look like in the future. NFTs and some of these things, it was felt that they were going to have this huge transformative impact, and then it just kind of fizzled out. And I'll end by saying that actually people continue to place a premium on physical objects, on paint. This is why painting has such a sort of big market. Particularly, I suppose, in a digital era, things that are made, or just at least physical, concrete material, have this sort of intrigue for people that they've always had for thousands of years, and that's interesting too.
Thank you for your question. Thanks, James. Well, I think we have time for one more question. Then people will be able to, I'm sure, ask questions while they get their books signed at the end of the session. Yes.
Yes, well, I was going to ask about Wasteland. So you said it was an important, is it a key to understanding the book, or is it a private framework that you wove the novel around?
I love that question because I could answer it both ways. It was a private framework. It was something I was thinking about and playing with as I wrote it, and I've borrowed quite deliberately certain sort of phrases or images from it. But people have spotted it as well, and you don't need to know that it's in there. I don't think it wouldn't transform your interpretation of the novel to discover it. It's not essential that you know it or don't know it. And I think often with allusions or references, it's good that that's the case. I don't think that, there shouldn't be some code that has to be unlocked. But I guess in general, what I love about that poem and what I wanted to repeat here was this sense of kind of, the fractured nature of social encounters, the fleeting fractured nature, the way in which sometimes our experiences with other people are incredibly deep and full of feeling and power, and other times very often they're sort of fleeting and fragmentary and kind of meaningless, and it's hard to make sense of what they were. So I wanted it to have that double aspect.
Thank you very much. Well, I hope you all agree we've had a lovely evening. Let's give James a well-deserved round of applause. Thank you.
Thanks, Ilka. Thank you.
Thank you as well to Mark and the team at Hatchards, who've made us so very welcome this evening. And it goes without saying that James will be waiting here to answer more questions and to sign copies of his book. I will also be doing the same, but I won't be annoyed or hurt much. If you don't mind, bye. No, but I do have a stamp.
It's marvellous, yeah. Reason alone to get, yes.
I have a stamp because I'm not literary. You could imagine if you had a stamp and sprayed edges on. I'm
going to get a stamp.
They wouldn't review it in the Guardian, would they? Be like, "What's this? He's gone down in the world." No, but thank you for a wonderful evening. You'll be stamping and signing here, I assume.
I think so. Yeah.
All right, Mark.
Thanks,
Thank
AJ.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Beautiful.